Hey everyone, and welcome back to Mighty Ride Junkies. We have a lot to cover today, so we're just going to jump right into it. Today, we are mourning the losses of all the rides that are no longer in existence at Magic Mountain and what exactly happened to them. I tried to get all the information that I could, but prior to Six Flags owning Magic Mountain really didn't keep a very good track record of their rides, so I apologize for that in advance. So let's continue. On opening day, the park had El Bumpo, which was just bumper boats and located in the pond of Magic Mountain. This is another ride like bumper cars where there's nothing special about it. The ride was eventually discontinued in 1979 after the summer season. Continuing with opening day, we have Galaxy, a Ferris wheel on steroids. This actually looked pretty cool, and it's a shame Magic Mountain chose to remove this from their park after the 1979 season. What's worse is what it was replaced with: Swashbuckler and Buccaneer, trading this very original ride for two common rides that you find everywhere. Next, we have the short lived Billy the Squid, a kiddie ride that didn't even last a full 2 years. The ride basically spin you around while randomly lifting you up and down. A major gear that operated this ride needed to be replaced, but due to the cost, Magic Mountain chose to remove it and replace the ride in 1973 with Jolly Monster, which also isn't around anymore. Moving on to Circus Wheel, which is basically the same thing as Wonder Woman's Lasso of Truth, except you're sitting down. Like Lasso of Truth, this Trabant ride is just another carnival style ride that was torn down in 1999. However, another ride, which I'll get to in a bit, took the same name and was used until 2008. Crazy Barrels. This ride, you basically sat in a barrel that spun you in one direction as you would spin a wheel located inside the barrel to go the opposite direction. Sound familiar? The Rise ceased operation in 1989 for unknown reasons. However, it's still very much at the park. While the barrels themselves are nowhere to be found, you can actually find the platform for the ride behind a white picket fence as you enter the County Fair game area. Eagle's Flight. This was a skyway or skylift ride that took park goers over the park, giving them an eagle's eye view of the area. Magic Mountain had two different tracks for Eagle's Flight, one being El Dorado and the other Galaxy. When Six Flags bought the park, one of their very first plans was to remove one of the tracks. In 1981, they chose El Dorado since an incident had occurred on it in the late 70s. Meanwhile, Galaxy lasted until 1994. The reason why it was taken down was that Six Flags personally thought the ride was meaningless now, since the park was establishing itself as a thrill park and some of the roller coasters they had created were going about just as high as Galaxy went. And they knew they were already developing new rides that would go much higher. Granny's Grand Prix. This ride was treated like the redheaded stepchild. While the ride is simply driving a gas powered go kart with a major speed cap on a guided track, rides like this are still very popular in the theme park world for whatever reason. Even when I was years away from getting my driver's license, I never thought these kinds of rides were worth it. Realizing it was a kid's ride, the park moved it in 1988 to the new Bugs Bunny World, where it stayed until 2007. The original location is where Tidal Wave now stands, and the second location was basically demolished to expand the kids' area. This next ride, I don't know if Magic Mountain was trying to hide it because they were embarrassed by it, because of how hard it was to find the information for this thing. Opening as Yankee Doodle Dandy its first year of operation, the boat ride sat about 4 people leg to back as they went down a guided track on a sailboat. It changed its name the following year to what it actually was, the Sailboat Ride, until Six Flags changed the name to the Little Sailor Ride. In 1985, it ceased operation for low attendance and interest. Log Jammers, a ride I've mentioned many times. If you like ridiculously long log flume rides where you only get 2 drops out of it, then be my guest and find Doc Brown. At almost 4 minutes, you'll wait to go down a 40-foot drop and then a final drop at 88 feet, making it slightly higher than Jetstream. The ride was torn down the day after Halloween 2011 in order to begin construction of Full Throttle. thank God. Metro. Another transportation ride which took you to two different ends of a massive park on a monorail that ran from opening day until 2000. When the new year began, the ride was not operating but continued to stay in place until 2008, until they finally announced they were removing the ride. However, they seem to be taking their sweet time with this, which leads me to believe they aren't destroying it, but rather relocating it. In 2011, they sold all the monorail trains to Hershey Park in Hershey, Pennsylvania, and slowly but surely are taking down piece by piece of the track and doing who knows what with it. As of this upload date, you can still find pieces of this track scattered throughout the park. Moving on to 99 Steam Train, which opened right after the summer season of the opening year at the park. It was a miniature version of a regular standard steam train and had all the same parts and bits as the full-size version. It ran down a 1.5 mile track which would take you through the homes of Magic Mountain's characters and acted as more of an entertainment ride rather than just a transportation ride. On October 12, 1980, 99 Steam Train held its last day of operation before being torn down the following year. Most of the parts were sold off to private collectors. However, one of the trains can be viewed to the public right down the street from Magic Mountain, and it has been fully restored. The ride was taken down because of low interest of the ride. Last ride of 1971, Bottoms Up. This was a classic pre-roller coaster era ride for theme parks. You basically sat in a closed circle as the ride began to spin. Eventually, the speed and force would get so intense you could do poses on the wall as your body was pressed against it. Or, like I used to do, try and fight the pull. It was renamed Spin Out the following year of operation. This is always a must for me when I was a teenager at Magic Mountain. No wait, and you and your friends could just goof around and have a good time riding a classic ride. Sadly, the no wait was a curse in disguise, as it was the reason the ride was torn down in 2008. Moving on to 1973, we have Jolly Monster, which replaced Billy the Squid. The ride was basically the same premise as the ride it replaced, except it was now targeted towards families as opposed to just kids, with bigger heights, spins, and more spacious carts. However, this sort of backfired on Magic Mountain. The ride only saw teenagers and young adults riding it. Prior to its destruction, Six Flags had done a survey and found out that kids under 12 were too afraid to ride it by themselves. Adults had no interest in the ride unless their kids wanted to go on it, and most teens admitted it wasn't something they had to do when coming to the park. The park eventually tore down the ride in 1981, where it would be almost 7 years for this location in the park to see another ride. Mountain Express was a roller coaster that would take riders down 1,837 feet of track, going through multiple drops at about 40 miles per hour. The ride went down a steady 20 miles an hour, only increasing speed at a drop and losing that speed when turning as the coaster cart worked its way down. Barely going over 2 Gs of force, the ride gave the vibe of an old boardwalk type ride before it closed down in 1982. Six Flags, for whatever reason, just didn't want the ride anymore and sold it to a park called Magic Landing. Magic Landing, however, had a lot of incidents that eventually led to the park closing down, and it sold all its assets in 1990. Mountain Express, which had been renamed Wildcat, sold the coaster to Magic Forest in Mexico as Roller Coaster Original, where it stayed until it was demolished in 2006. Sierra Twist is something I'm actually surprised lasted as long as it did. This is the same premise as Flash Speed Force, except you were in a bobsled-like coaster cart and didn't go backwards. So basically a downgrade. The ride lasted until 2008 when it was shut down because of maintenance issues, which makes me believe if these issues had never arisen, this ride may still be in the park today. On to 1974 with Dragon. Very similar to the Orient Express, this transportating ride closed in 1981 simply because it wasn't needed for Magic Mountain's new direction when Six Flags took over. However, The ride and track stayed in the park and was unused for almost 7 years, finally being torn down to make way for Ninja. Next time you are on Ninja and you're standing on the loading station, you are also on Dragon's loading station, as it was Dragon's upper station prior to Ninja occupying it. 1975 brought another train ride, the Grand Centennial Excursion Railroad. This train would take passengers through an old Western theme that slowly started to disappear when Six Flags bought the park. It was torn down in 1985 because it didn't fit with Magic Mountain's new theme of the tallest and fastest roller coasters. In 1977, not only did we get the first Star Wars movie, but we also got the Enterprise. Think of a Ferris wheel, but instead of shifting carts as you move, the carts are locked, meaning when you get to the top, you aren't upright, but instead upside down. It was renamed the Reactor in 1987, and it also received a new color scheme before being closed down after the summer season of 1993. Now onto the longest segment of this video, the original Colossus, which opened on June 29th, 1978. Magic Mountain was looking for a new ride to balance with their other rides, Revolution and Gold Rusher. On top of that, the park was doing fairly well and wanted to invest in a state-of-the-art roller coaster. However, after much deliberation, it was decided that a wooden ride would be better than another steel coaster. Since Revolution had broken the record for having the first successful vertical loop, they wanted to develop the biggest wooden roller coaster. So research began on other rides at other parks for 2 years before it finally began construction and opened in 1978. When it opened, it was the tallest and fastest roller coaster in the world at 4,325 feet of track and a G-force of 3.2. However, the only thing it beats Twisted Colossus at was speed, which it reached up to 62 miles per hour. So, what happened to the classic wooden roller coaster? Well, if you did ride this coaster before it became the steel hybrid, you may have noticed how it always managed to have a ridiculously shorter line than the rest of the coasters at the park, especially when it began competing for attention in the mid-90s. It being a massive classic, however, the park tried to get interest by putting ads and movies on the ride. In 2013, Six Flags did one last effort to save the ride's attendance by surveying what people's must-rides were when visiting Magic Mountain and what was their favorite ride in the park of all time. By this time, Magic Mountain had already had 19 coasters since the opening of Full Throttle. Colossus ranked 11th in both categories. What's worse is a coaster that no longer existed in the park had beaten the wooden classic for favorite roller coaster of all time in the park. The planning began to update Colossus to make it a more attractive ride. Right before the summer season, Magic Mountain announced to come ride Colossus because once the summer season was over, they would be closing the ride forever. Needless to say, this did not sit well with many ride junkies. There were penchants to make this ride a California landmark, people protesting never to attend Magic Mountain or any Six Flags park again if the ride was torn down. Magic Mountain did its best to hold off the horde without spilling the beans. They even held a 36-hour non-stop ride event for Colossus a week before closure. Out of the 24 people who signed up for the event, 6 actually finished it. However, when the ride finally closed on August 16, 2014, Six Flags announced the steel hybrid Twisted Colossus, not even a full 2 weeks after closure, to stop all the grumbling. Fiesta Dance was introduced to the park in 1981, a tilt-a-whirl ride that wasn't getting a lot of attention, even after its many name changes, including Circus Wheel, which had been recycled back in. In 2008, it closed to make room for a carnival game. I am not kidding. Freefall opened in 1982 and stood in the middle of Riddler's Revenge after the coaster was built. Like Lex Luthor's Drop of Doom, it was a freefall ride, hence the name. However, towards the end, you would find yourself looking up at the sky. This type of freefall ride is still fairly popular in Europe. Interesting fact, too, about the design company in Timon, They would return to Magic Mountain to build Green Lantern and are very famous for building California Screamin' and Accelerator at nearby parks Disneyland and Knott's Berry Farm. However, this wasn't the only ride Intamin was responsible for. In 1984, it came out with Sarajevo's bobsleds, which ditched the conventional tracks of a coaster and put you down a sort of half-pipe track to make it feel like you were actually bobsledding. Stepping back a moment to explain the Six Flags ride program to better understand these next couple rides, Six Flags started the ride program in the early 80s, and basically it was a way for the company to introduce new rides into a different park and replace those now empty lands with a coaster from another park. Basically a rotation of rides. Magic Mountain didn't see a lot of rides arrive, more so more rides left because they already had more coasters than any other park. This is exactly what happened to Sarajevo's bobsleds. It closed in 1986 and relocated in Six Flags Over Texas, where it was called La Vibra. That's totally wrong. My Spanish is horrible. Continuing with the ride program, Shockwave immediately took its place the year the bobsleds left. One of the world's first stand-up roller coasters, it would take you through 2,300 feet of track at 55 miles per hour. Its highest drop was only 85 feet, but the ride did receive a lot of attention. Now, this ride was not meant for Magic Mountain at all. In fact, it was constructed for Astroworld, but because of the ride rotation, it was sent to Magic Mountain first, and it didn't last long. In 1988, the ride program had moved it over to Six Flags Great Adventure in New Jersey in an attempt to boost attendance. Finally, in 1993, it arrived at Astroworld and was renamed Batman The Escape. When Astroworld closed down in 2005, the ride was dismantled and placed in an undisclosed storage facility. In an attempt to sell more tickets, Magic Mountain released Z-Force in 1987, advertising it as a Top Gun rip-off attraction. It was your typical looping shuttle that was demolished in 1993 for Batman the Ride. Another short-lived ride was Condor, which opened in 1988 and it closed the following year for poor ride attendance. It was basically spinning ships, except you would increase speed and rise 112 feet in the air to make it feel like you were a condor spinning in a circle like a bird finding its prey. You can now find it at Six Flags Great America. Next up is Cyclone, which opened in 1991. This was a 2,970-foot wooden roller coaster that would drop you 77 feet as you would feel 3 Gs of force while going 55 miles per hour. At least when you weren't turning, at which times you would go below 10 miles per hour. Cyclone had every potential to be a great Woody. However, in 1994, after a severe earthquake left serious damage to the ride, the park invested to fix it up, and while the repairs were successful, the ride now had to operate differently since some of the damage couldn't fully be replaced without taking out major parts of the ride. This is just an example to easily explain what I mean by this, but in no way this is what actually happened. Basically, you have part of the track that suffered damage on top and in the middle. The top is no problem, simply just take it off and replace it. However, the middle, not so much. As you further examine it, you realize you can't replace that piece without taking out more pieces, and potentially you would end up just with a brand new ride altogether. So instead, you just put some really good duct tape on it and hold it together to pass those safety tests before opening it back to the public. And because it's held together by duct tape instead of brand new parts, the coaster has to naturally operate differently. So with its actual own real life repairs of actually switching out the parts, not using duct tape, because that was just an example, these changes massively affected the ride. Now, the ride was so slow, there had to be a certain amount of people on the coaster just to make it run. If there wasn't enough people in the coaster cart, it ran the risk of losing momentum and actually coming to a complete stop on the track. Because of this, the coaster only had one cart running every operation day, and it wasn't allowed to leave the station until 75% of the cart was filled. Imagine being this guy trying to run this ride on a slow day. A no wait time turns into a 30-minute wait time just waiting for people to actually show up to ride it. During the summer season of 2006, a survey was completed by Six Flags pass holders for their favorite rides in the park. While this is a very flawed survey, Cyclone came in dead last. That same year, Cyclone was placed second to last ranking out of all the wooden roller coasters in the United States. Needless to say, Magic Mountain immediately announced its closure, and in early 2007, it was finally torn down. Interesting enough, Apocalypse, the wooden roller coaster that now sits where Cyclone once sat, has a lot of similarities in track design. After the ride was destroyed, the carts were used on the original Colossus, and after Twisted Colossus opened, the carts were put into storage. Now we move on to a ride that used to have a major cult following, Flashback. Flashback was only 1,900 feet of track. It only went 35 miles per hour, and the biggest drop was only 35 feet. Yet its sudden speed increases and ridiculous sudden changes of direction gave this ride a 3.1 G of force, making this ride notorious for making your ribs sore after riding. While simple, the uniqueness of this ride gave Flashback a lot of fans. It originally was sitting in Six Flags Great America when it opened in 1985, before moving to Six Flags Over Georgia in 1988, before finally coming to Magic Mountain in 1992, where it stayed until its closure in 2003. However, the ride was left standing for quite some time, leading many to believe it would eventually reopen. By 2008, the ride was finally taken down and put into storage. This led a lot of speculation that the ride was simply moving to another park. However, this was quickly scrapped after the ride was scrapped for parts later that year. Now we get to a coaster that can have a confusing history, and that's Deja Vu. Deja Vu is a boomerang ride, meaning once the coaster on the track leaves, it would take you through multiple inversions at 65 miles per hour before reaching the end of the track, and it would send you back the way you came. Now, there were 3 Deja Vus within the Six Flags company, but we're just going to focus on this one in particular. When Deja Vu opened at Magic Mountain on August 25th, 2001, the ride had major issues. First, a height restriction was put on within the first month because it was discovered riders could reach up and touch the track since it was an inverted ride. Until the problem was solved about a month later, you couldn't be taller than 5'9" in order to ride the ride. Heavy upper shoulder restraints fixed this problem by locking the rider in without the ability to move their arms past their shoulders. However, this created another problem. With one part of your body being locked down like a state penitentiary and your lower half being free as a bird, the jerkiness of the ride started causing some serious micro tears in arteries for some heavy riders. Deja Vu didn't see a lot of riders after standing for a few years, and the decision was made to move this Deja Vu to Six Flags New England. The ride closed in October 2011, and when it reopened in its new home in May the following year, it was known as Goliath. Last on this amazingly long list is Thrill Shot. Another pay extra if you want to ride. Thrill Shot opened in 2001 but closed on a regular basis due to technical difficulties. Seriously, this ride was opened about as often as you'd hear Disney saying they were lowering their prices. With major and costly refurbishments needed, the ride shut down permanently in 2009. When Magic Mountain climbed out of debt, they chose not to reopen this ride ever and took it down in 2012. And that wraps up all the rides that used to be. But do not fear, we are still not done with Six Flags Magic Mountain yet. I do have a few more things planned, so be sure to check back, and the easiest way to do that is subscribe. If you learned something new, please hit that like button, and I'll see you soon.